Hi, everybody. I'm Tracy Butcher, the Director of Outreach for Wildlands Network, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time from your very busy schedules to join us today. We're very excited to tell you about our road ecology work in North Carolina. Conservation wins are a bit rare lately, so we're very excited to be able to report on our inspiring work and good news. I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Ron Sutherland, our conservation scientist and Eastern Program Director. Ron is responsible for a swath of projects, starting with designing habitat connectivity models for the entire Southeast, coordinating a collaborative effort to map the entire Eastern Wildway, and passionately driving our red wolf recovery efforts, including an extensive camera trap project in the red wolf recovery area in North Carolina. Between 2013 and 2015, Ron ran a successful campaign for Wildlands Network to save the 79,000-acre Hoffman Forest in eastern North Carolina, and it was stopped from being sold and destroyed by private buyers, largely to his efforts. Ron has earned his bachelor's degree in biology from North Carolina State University, and he has a master's in conservation biology and sustainable development from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. His master's research focused on the conflicting goals of population and wildlife conservation within villages near the, I'm going to try to pronounce this properly, Ron, Ka'aya National Park, the largest national park in Bolivia. He then went on to receive his PhD in environmental science and policy from the Nichols School of the Environment at Duke University, where he studied the response of wildlife to urbanization and vehicle traffic in the Sandhills region of North Carolina. Ron lives in Durham, North Carolina with his wife, his 3 children, and a dog named Henry. And few people know this about Ron, but he fancies himself an excellent ping pong player. I'm also going to introduce to you Emily Blanchard. She is a conservationist working for Wildlands Network. She's been under the weather and was going to help present today, but has lost her voice a little bit. So she's present, but won't be presenting. But because so much of her work is involved in this, I wanted to make sure you got to meet her. Emily manages a rather large and important portfolio of field research projects for Wildlands Network in the Southeast. She coordinates our camera trapping in the red wolf recovery area in eastern North Carolina, where we have more than 100 cameras cataloging the occurrence of game species, red wolf activity, and other species of interest. She's evaluating our wildlife bridge monitoring data in Durham and monitors the GPS-collared elk movements in western North Carolina. You'll hear more about these projects today. Emily also assists Ron and our partners with GIS mapping, and she coordinates the North Carolina Wildlife's Road Working Group. She also leads the Student Red Wolf Working Group in the Triangle region of North Carolina. She graduated from Barnard College, Columbia University, where she majored in environmental policy, and she worked in the environmental health and justice field before being selected for a year-long fellowship for an environmental photojournalism project called Faces of Environmental Change. She obtained her Master's of Environmental Management in 2015 from Duke University, and her master's research focused on forest elephants and the effects of hunting on wildlife communities in Gabon. If ever Emily takes a break from this full plate and meaningful conservation work, she likes to lighten her step by studying foreign languages, astronomy, and quantum physics. So moving on from these 2 very talented people, and before I hand it over, I would just like to mention that if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them in the question box, and this is typically located on the right side of your screen in the dashboard. After the presentation, we will address questions, and if there's time, we will open the floor for discussions to all participants. So thanks once again for joining us, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Ron Sutherland.
Great. Thanks, Tracy, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for tuning in. This is exciting. Happy to have the chance to talk to you about some of our road ecology projects that we're doing here in the Southeast United States. And I thought I would start a quick story about the bear you're seeing on the screen. That's a real bear, and we were driving on a road. We're on the way to check some of our wildlife cameras down in the Red Wolf Recovery area, and we came across this young bear wandering aimlessly down the middle of the road. And we ended up having to go around him to get down to where we were going, and on the way back, he was still there, walking across the road. Just had no idea what he was doing. And we talked to a waitress at a local restaurant in Columbia, and she said the locals all knew about the bear, that he was an orphan, had been orphaned a little too young, didn't really have a chance to learn from his mother much of anything, much less how to get across roads safely. So we don't know if that bear survived or not, but just a good individual case study of the dangers that roads pose to wildlife and our landscapes. So hopefully you made it. But let's begin. I should say a little bit about Wildlands Network. For those of you who might not know that much about us, we are a nonprofit conservation group whose mission is to reconnect, restore, and rewild North America so that life in all of its diversity can thrive. We work in the United States, in Mexico, and Canada, and we're trying to stitch together the landscapes back together again so that we have a holistic network for keeping biodiversity on this continent. What makes us different from other conservation groups? Well, we've always had this realistic, this ambitious, optimistic, continental scale vision of what it would take to protect nature in North America. And because of that, we've also had this emphasis on habitat connectivity long before it was a trendy subject like it is now. But we were some of the early folks to work on habitat connectivity, and we're still going strong. We also have a focus on top carnivores and other keystone species, not because they're cute and cuddly or charismatic megafauna, but because they are so important for ecosystems, because that's what the science says. Hence our work on red wolves and other species like that. And then most relevant to today, we've always had a leadership role in working on road ecology efforts, trying to help wildlife get across roads. So why focus on roads and wildlife? Well, it seems obvious, I guess. Roads have lethal effects. But really, it's not an understatement to say that roads are sort of the most lethal barrier to wildlife movement across the landscape, particularly here in the eastern United States, where we have so many roads. They just really get in the way. And to hit that home a little bit, this is not a red-eyed tree frog. This is a barking tree frog that unfortunately had a run-in with a car on a road I found it on my PhD work. And it's just sad when you think of the way wildlife gets hurt on the highways. I can show you a lot of pictures from my PhD and from just the animals we've seen driving around doing our various field projects. Here's a bobcat that got run over. Roads, they kill and maim individual animals. They endanger populations, sometimes even endanger entire species. They block seasonal migrations. You've probably heard of the path of the pronghorn or the mule deer migrations out by Yellowstone. They hamper climate adaptation. A lot of species need to move for climate change, and then roads get in the way of that. They interrupt gene flow. That's very important to maintaining healthy populations. And just overall, roads sort of ruin habitat connectivity. So what are we doing about it at Wildlands Network? Well, what the science shows is the best solution, besides not building the roads at all, or besides ripping the roads out, which is another thing we can talk about. But the best solution, according to the data we have so far, is actual structural improvements, wildlife road crossings like this one, that help animals either go over roads or under roads without actually interacting with the cars at all. Things that rely on drivers to avoid hitting animals don't seem to be nearly as effective as actual physical separation. A lot of folks have seen pictures of bridges like this one in Banff National Park. They're kind of internationally famous. Thanks to Facebook, there's some great memes going around of all the wildlife crossings in Europe right now. The United States, we're still playing catch up in this arena. There's more of them in the western United States than in the east. And Florida does have a healthy number of wildlife crossings right now. But we'd like the east to catch up. And so the big question becomes, where can we put these wildlife crossings to have the most positive impact for wildlife in this part of the continent? And fortunately, Wildlands Network happens to be sort of experts in habitat connectivity, and we've done various maps and models of connectivity priorities across different scales. Here I'm showing you our entire Eastern Wildway network. This is a draft design that we've come up with for basically the entire eastern portion of the continent, showing green core areas and yellow potential corridors. So we've looked at connectivity at that scale. We've done connectivity models at the regional scale. Here, this is a timber rattlesnake model we did for the South Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative, stretching from the panhandle of Florida up there to southern Virginia. And the green areas are sort of higher predicted flow of rattlesnakes on the landscape. And then here at the sort of sub-regional level, you're looking at Western North Carolina. We mapped out some priority wildlife corridors for the Blue Ridge Forever Coalition of Land Trusts. And the corridors are shown in red and yellow. The existing protected areas are shown in green there. And when you think about it, the basic science of where to put wildlife crossings is not too hard. If you know where the priority areas are for wildlife movement on the landscape, and you know where the major roads are, they're shown in black on this map, then you can fairly easily identify the intersections of those two components. So those are shown in blue. Hopefully you can see some of these areas in blue on this map. So, you know, the question is, how do we do that at a scale that we can identify, you know, the priorities of where to put these crossing structures? We've done that for North Carolina at a statewide scale. We finished a report in 2017 where we used our own wildlife connectivity data. We used wildlife vehicle collision data, like deer collision data from the North Carolina DOT, and some other variables. And we actually we made a prioritization for wildlife crossings across the entire road network for North Carolina in 2017. And I can send you that if you would like me to. But you know, the modeling and the connectivity modeling is only one approach. You know, we've used Clemson supercomputer and other things, but we enjoy fieldwork just as much. And so the bulk of my presentation today is actually going to focus on two ongoing field projects that we have underway right now. And one of those is here in Durham, in North Carolina, where I'm based. And Durham's part of the rapidly urbanizing, suburbanizing triangle region of North Carolina. There's not that many opportunities for wildlife movement left. But the New Hope Creek corridor shown here, there's some green protected areas. It's sort of a remnant wildlife corridor that stretches from the Jordan Lake game lands in the south up to Duke Forest, and then to the Eno River State Park, and Falls Lake has some game lands as well. So this urban wildlife corridor actually is a crucial component to connecting about 100,000 acres of wildlife habitat in this otherwise very urban environment. And we are monitoring two very different bridges along this corridor so far. We might like to expand that in the future. The big one is this bridge over NC 15501, and it's a huge bridge. It's 300 feet long now, and it's got an interesting story. This bridge, they were going to widen the highway back in the early 2000s, and some local environmental advocates sort of caught wind of that, and they actually banded together and pushed really hard to make sure the DOT, because they recognized the value of this New Hope Creek corridor, and they pushed really hard and made the DOT make the bridge wider and taller than it otherwise would have needed to be, just for the traffic alone. So we ended up with this magnificent 300-foot bridge. And NC State University did a pre-study of the old bridge, looking at wildlife going under the old bridge. And it was meant that they would do a follow-up study, but nobody ever did a follow-up study. So the situation was ripe for Wildlands Network to step in, and we wanted to evaluate how well this big investment in wildlife movement was actually working. So we've gone in and we've installed cameras using some custom wooden mounts. We weren't allowed to drill them into the bridge, but we did get permission from the DOT to put these cameras out there. Under the 15501 bridge, I think we have 10 cameras now. It's such a huge bridge, it takes a lot of cameras to monitor what's going on underneath there. The other bridge, NC 54, it's a lot smaller. In fact, I don't have any good pictures of the whole bridge because it's small and obscured by vegetation. But we were able to use just 4 cameras under that bridge, and we wedged them in there with these fancy box structures that you can see here between the concrete girders there, because that's what we had to work with. And I should say that these camera mounts we had help designing and building them from a couple of folks. John Kent there on the left, he actually was one of the people that advocated for that 15501 bridge improvement in the first place. And then John Sutherland on the right, that's my dad. He helped build these things too. Plus he helped me learn how to do woodworking. So he's got lots of credit there. And so we've been checking these cameras at the Durham site now for just over a year. We're building up a nice data set, and we're seeing a ton of deer going under the 15501 bridge, which is, deer are not an endangered species, but from the human safety perspective, that's very important. And we think there's also some other species going under as well. But here's, like, we're getting herds of up to 12 deer go under that bridge at once, on different sides of the creek as well. So here's some of those. We're also getting coyotes. It's probably the second most common species under there right now. And then some other species, raccoons, possums, even a groundhog or two going under there. And the NC54 bridge, more or less sort of the same types of species, but we're seeing less deer, less big groups of deer going into there, more single groups. So it's a smaller bridge. Doesn't seem to have the room for the entire herds of deer to go under at once. So that's interesting. And so what we're hoping to do now is take all this data and present, or take it, integrate it together, do the analysis. It's one thing Emily's going to be working on, is running through this analysis, figuring out how many deer have actually gone under the bridge. And we want to make a nice video out of this thing and take it to the public as a success story of how this Durham 15501 bridge is actually working to promote wildlife movement under this, or across this really important wildlife corridor. And we think if we can do that, we can make this, it's an important wildlife corridor for its own right. It does connect two different river basins, the Neuse and the Cape Fear River basins. But we also think that it can serve as a really good case study. And because it's here in the Triangle, we have a lot of good environmentalist support here in the Triangle area of North Carolina. We think we can use it to leverage investments in other wildlife crossings around North Carolina and possibly even other southeastern states. So it's going to be a good sort of successful case study. Now, shifting geographies a bit, the other field project we have is going on right now in western North Carolina, where we're looking at trying to get elk across Interstate 40 next to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And this area is famous for being a biodiversity hotspot, not just for plants and trees, but also for things like salamanders. This is a global sort of richness map for salamanders, and you can see that the red area here in western North Carolina, Tennessee, and so forth is actually the sort of the global hotspot for salamander richness in the entire world. So this area is very diverse. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which is shown sort of roughly here by the blue, it's been the subject of some all-taxa biodiversity surveys now for a number of years. And we just know that it's tremendously diverse. It's about 500,000 acres, tons of mature hardwood forests, and just all kinds of different environments. And there's so much diversity there. And that diversity, with climate change, some of those species are going to want to move north, along the spine of the Appalachian Mountains, going all the way up into the northeast and into Canada. And other species, they need more than 500,000 acres, as we've seen in even Denali National Park turns out not to be big enough for holding all of its wolves inside. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, 500,000 acres is huge, but we need the connections between the national park and those national forests around the park to stay sound for the biodiversity. Things like bear and bobcats, they need more than 500,000 acres. Unfortunately, there's a big interstate that runs right on the northeast side of the park, Interstate 40, which goes from the coastal North Carolina all the way out to California. And I-40, it basically blocks that wildlife movement opportunities, particularly to the north. So that climate change adaptation direction is stymied by this big interstate highway. And in that area, the interstate runs through what's called the Pigeon River Gorge, and it's a beautiful gorge. It's really a shame that there's an interstate in it, because if it was a hiking trail, this would be one of the finer hiking opportunities, I think, in the East Coast. But instead, it ends up having a 4-lane busy highway, and with steep rock walls on both sides. It's kind of the last place that you would want to run into an elk or any other large species. I'm sure the elk would agree. We want to prevent this thing. And elk were reintroduced into Great Smoky Mountains National Park in the early 2000s, and they've been doing pretty well ever since. The population's grown up to, there's different estimates, but I think counting the elk that are outside the park, I think they're up to somewhere over 200, 250 elk now in that area. And the population continues to grow, and we expect the habitat outside of the national park is actually better for elk. They're kind of an early successional species, and so that mature hardwood forest in the park is not as good for them as the grasslands, private areas outside the park. So the elk are expanding and moving, and the question is, how can we keep scenes like this from becoming more and more common in North Carolina? Nobody wants to hit a 1,000-pound elk. The good news is that studies out in the West have shown that elk will use these wildlife crossing structures, both underpasses and overpasses. And so the question becomes, where can we put these crossings to help elk get across I-40, help other species get across I-40, and other roads nearby that are also hemming in this elk population at the national park. To address that question, Emily spearheaded an effort last year. We started this GPS collaring project for elk with the help of the National Park Service, and we're also working with National Parks Conservationist Association and the North Carolina Wildlife Federation and the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, some other partners as well, to work on this. And so far we've had 5 out of 11 elk collars deployed on some elk, and we're going to put the rest of them out this fall when the weather turns cool and the current crop of calves is grown up enough where the mothers can take a break from the calves long enough to get a collar on. And so these different colors show you the 5 different elk. These are just some of the recent locations, not all the locations that we've had since the collars were deployed. But if we look, this elk, here's I-40 running along the side of the national park, Cherokee National Forest, and this is the national park here. You can see my cursor. Let's zoom in on the elk up there at I-40. We were fortunate to have one elk that we already knew of, that we knew had showed up along I-40 and on the other side of I-40 from the place where the elk hang out during the winter in Cataloochee. And so we were able to collar her, and she has not disappointed us. She's already shown us several places where she crosses this interstate, and so we're excited about that, and we think that she can be a great ambassador for her species in terms of teaching us where she would like to cross the interstate. And here she is. We were able to track her down using her latest collar data, and she's doing well. She had a calf after we had her collared earlier this spring, and so she's doing good. Other elk that we've collared have gone in the other direction. They've gone south. It's hard to, it is hard to know. We got lucky with the one, but it's hard to know which direction the elk are going to go. But some of the other elk are going south towards Maggie Valley right here, and there's a highway that comes through this area. It's called US 19, and that area actually possibly gets even more elk vehicle collisions than I-40 does, probably because there's a lot of private land, farmland and grasslands along this road. And as you can see with this animal, it's spending a lot of time along that highway, and so it's not surprising that we're getting more vehicle mortality. It is going to be interesting to try to figure out how to mitigate that when you can see this animal uses several miles of this highway and crosses back and forth on a regular basis. So that's going to be pretty interesting to try to sort out. So we're going to keep going with the GPS collars. We'll put more on this fall and keep going with the collars next year as well. In the meantime, we're also going to deploy some other data collection methods to sort of round out the elk data, because we can only do so many elk with the collars, but we can also use cameras. So we're going to be deploying a set of, I think, at least 80 motion-sensitive wildlife cameras along this portion of I-40 next to the national park. And we're not going to just put them sort of randomly out there on the landscape. We'd like to put them in places along the road. You can see these a couple pictures here show from the Virginia DOT. They did a similar project on an interstate in Virginia where they put cameras along the road in strategic points. So for I-40, we are going to identify places, hopefully with the help of an engineer, identify places where it would actually be feasible to put wildlife crossings along that stretch of highway, because given the rocks and cliffs and things, not every part of that highway is actually feasible. And then if we put cameras out along those feasible points, then and collect wildlife data for a period of a year or two, then we'll be able to compare them and say which areas that are feasible are also the most important for wildlife moving along that road, and might be the most important. And this sort of thing is important yeah, when I was out in Utah a year or two ago for a road ecology meeting, we got to visit a road crossing site that the Utah DOT put in, and they put it in quickly without really thinking about animal movement and without any data. And what they found is it didn't work at all, even though most studies have shown really high success rates for these things. But if you put in a wildlife crossing where no wildlife actually wants to go, then you're going to end up with poor results, and that's bad when these things are expensive. So the cameras are going to be helpful. We also want to put some of the cameras out on some of the existing crossing points that might be suitable for wildlife already. And the most obvious of those is this. There's a double tunnel where the interstate goes through a mountain, and the land bridge over the highway there is sort of an obvious route for wildlife. So we'll put cameras up there. And there are a few other bridges underneath the highway for small roads like the one shown here, and creeks, and of course the Pigeon River itself. There's a few bridges where the Pigeon River cuts under the interstate. So we'd like to put cameras under those as well to see how well they're already working for wildlife. And it could turn out that things like this, I mean, this looks like a wildlife crossing to me already. It's a quiet gravel road. And what's missing perhaps is fencing. One of the components of successful wildlife crossings is having fencing to steer animals to these crossings. So it may be that with some enhancements like better fencing, that we can make these existing holes under the interstate work a lot better, and then focus our attention on the gaps between these existing structures to know where else we would like to advocate for putting wildlife crossing structures. So, and lastly, we also want to combine in some roadkill surveys. And some of that can be done by car. You can see a dead deer, or elk, or a bear by car, but walking surveys in places where it's safe to walk on the sort of the other side of the guardrail from the highway have been proven to be the most effective way of really surveying the small animals, like the snakes. Here's a dead timber rattlesnake, which is an important species up there in the mountains. The salamanders that we talked about, the high salamander diversity. You're not going to see salamanders driving along the interstate at interstate speed. So, but if we can get out there and walk along the interstate, we actually might be able to target some of these smaller species with roadkill. And we'll be asking the State Highway Patrol in both North Carolina and Tennessee, and also the road cleanup crews, when they respond to a deer vehicle accident, to record a more accurate location. The DOT and highway safety folks, they keep that sort of data, but they don't always keep it very accurate. And which, from our standpoint, we want to have as precise of data as we can. So we're going to work on getting some standardized data collection methods going. National Parks Conservation Association is helping us with that. But trying to get the agencies to sort of cooperate together, have a standardized data collection method across that stretch of interstate. So that's, I guess, going back to this, we're going to get all these different data sets together, the roadkill data, the camera data, and then the elk GPS data. And we're going to integrate those different data sets together into what we hope will be a complete picture of what's going on with wildlife with respect to this stretch of interstate between the national park and the national forest to the north. And then we hope we will be able to advocate successfully to the North Carolina and Tennessee Departments of Transportation to start thinking about, to implement our recommendations. So we hope we'll identify at least a few key locations where these wildlife crossings would make sense and would have the most impact for protecting wildlife and enhancing the flow of biodiversity out of this tremendous national park. And what we've learned in some other states is that a small group of sort of concerned citizens and environmental advocates, conservation groups can work together and push for these things fairly successfully, particularly, if we're able to bring the public along, convince the folks in Asheville and Knoxville that this is a big priority, and also generate some seed funding. If we can put together some seed funding to get these, like if we identify a key place for a wildlife crossing on I-40, if we can put together a small pot of money to get that project started, we can leverage that money. This has been done in states like Colorado and other places. Leverage that money with state dollars, and then use the state dollars to leverage federal dollars, and actually find a way to pay for these structures and get them implemented more quickly than you would assume. So that's the basic plan for the Smokies project. Future research directions. I should mention a few things that we think are important. to keep looking at. We've done work where we've identified sort of lots of different wildlife crossing opportunities around, like North Carolina, around the Southeast, and that can be overwhelming when you're trying to talk to the DOT, talk to the media, and talk to the public. So what we'd like to do is try to narrow down our lists of important places to sort of top 10 lists or even top 3 lists. So we'd like to be able to, if someone asks us, we'd like to be able to say, what are the top 10 most important wildlife crossing opportunities, places to put these crossing structures in North Carolina, so that if something comes up and funding becomes available, then we can push for them. Same thing for the entire Southeast. What are the most important areas for the Southeast? And then for the entire Eastern Wildway, from Florida up to Quebec, say, what are the top 20 wildlife crossings for that entire wildway, and how can we make that into a campaign to focus attention on those key places that would really, if we can mitigate the roads and their impacts on wildlife in those key places, we'd actually be making progress. That's one area we'll be working on for the next year or two. And then another thing that's near and dear to my heart, since I did my PhD in a longleaf pine forest environment, we don't know very much about how to get wildlife across roads in longleaf pine ecosystems. And these are sort of the biodiversity hotspot of the southeastern coastal plain, from Virginia down to Florida and around over to East Texas. And these ecosystems are sort of, they're also a biodiversity hotspot. They're full of reptile and amphibian species, and those reptile and amphibian species are sort of universally bad at crossing roads. They hop on the road and they stop and watch the car smush them. Or in the case of like timber rattlesnakes or other species, they crawl across the road at like 1 mile an hour, and they just have basically no chance of getting across. So there needs to be more work done to identify not only how to build a crossing either over or under the highway, but also like the types of fencing that would work to keep small animals, gopher frogs or tiger salamanders and things. Chain link fences don't work very well for herps. So we got to figure out how to do that to facilitate. And this particular location here is sort of stylistically showing that the two halves of the Sand Hill Game Lands in North Carolina, which add up to about 60,000 acres of nice longleaf pine habitat. And tragically, there's this 4-lane highway, US 1, that goes right between the middle of them. It is an opportunity, though, we think, to where we could work on convincing the DOT and other groups to mitigate that by putting some great wildlife crossings there. On the policy front, there's some good things to talk about. Right now, thanks to the leadership of our DC staffer, Susan Holmes, there's some headway being made with a National Wildlife Corridors Act. And this act would be sort of to wildlife corridors what the Wilderness Act is to wilderness. It would help designate official national wildlife corridors around the country, and then would sort of steer funds and policy attention and protections towards those corridors, including, we think, an emphasis on mitigating roads within those corridors. So that National Wildlife Corridors Act, it's doing surprisingly well given the political situation in DC right now. And I thought I should mention, it's easy to assume that everybody in Congress is not very environmentally friendly right now, but there are some true champions for wildlife left in Congress, like Representative Don Beyer, shown here up on the Appalachian Trail with one of our staffers on a hike. And Don Beyer, he's championing the National Wildlife Corridors Act, and he's also doing all kinds of other great things for wildlife. So, Representative Beyer, if you're out there, keep up the great work. We need more folks like him, of course. And then I should say, at the state level, we're also working hard to implement state wildlife corridor legislation that would do sort of the same thing, but at the state level, push for designating and recognizing the importance of wildlife connectivity in different states, and that would also lead towards improvements, we think, in getting wildlife across these roads. In addition to designating official corridors and identifying the key places to put wildlife crossings across roads, the other key limiting factor is funding. And these crossing structures have been shown to be very effective, but they are expensive. They've been shown to be cost effective in terms of if you look at the property damage and the cost of sort of human life and injuries versus the cost of the structures, they pay for themselves, but you have to come up with the money. Unfortunately, you can't sort of pay in advance the saved amount of collision damage and that kind of thing. So we need to find a way to pay for these things up front so we can recognize the savings down the road. one strategy I've come up with would be to push for something like a 2-cent tax on gasoline. And they would pay for not just wildlife road crossings, but also for, strategically, we can think about combining that with a pedestrian crossings for humans to get across roads as well. So put those two coalitions together, the people that care about wildlife, the people that care about just not seeing animals dead on the road, and then all the folks that care about greenways and human safety and so forth. That's two huge coalitions that could come together to support something like this. And then you can add in all the people that would be involved in actually building these things. I mean, a 2-cent tax on gasoline would pay something like $1 billion or more per year, and that would be thousands of these structures getting implemented every year. That would put a lot of people to work, and so we think we could sort of build a coalition around this. And again, if it's not going to happen at the federal level just yet, we can push for this at the state level and try to get some states to adopt something like this. So we actually have a funding stream to pay for mitigating wildlife, getting them across roads. So we're almost at the end here, and I did want to thank our many partner organizations for their help in this exciting work that we're doing. It's great to have good partners. And all the work I've been talking about has been funded by private donors to Wildlands Network. So I really wanted to give a shout out to them. None of this would happen without the support we get. So thank you, those folks. And for extra credit, if anybody knows these two species of snakes that are intertwined up here, you can email me afterwards. Fittingly for the discussion today, of course, they're both roadkill, unfortunately, but they're beautiful animals. So how can you help? If you're out there listening to this presentation and you want to do something that can help, save that turtle you see crossing the road. We saw a couple of box turtles this weekend because of getting a lot of rain this time of year. Do it carefully. Don't become roadkill yourself. It can be easy to get hurt doing that kind of thing. But scaling up, you could be the person that starts that local initiative to reduce roadkill in your local area, like John Kent and others that push for the better bridge here in Durham. Maybe there's a bridge project in your area or road project where you could actually be the person that stands up and tells the DOT, you actually have to take wildlife into account when you're doing this project. Showing that local enthusiasm for protecting wildlife is really important. One thing that's less intuitive is to go talk to your local land trust, the land conservation groups, and encourage them to be open to buying land at key places for wildlife road crossings. And it's counterintuitive because we're asking land trusts to buy land, next to an interstate highway, which traditionally has been the last place you want to buy land for wildlife. In particular, if you're trying to conserve animals, you don't want it next to the highway. But in some cases, these key corridors where we want to connect the landscape, we need to have land on both sides of the highway. The state DOTs are reluctant to spend $1 million to build a wildlife road crossing at a given site if the land's not protected on either side of the road, because it could get developed. In fact, we saw that happen in North Carolina down at the coast. The DOT did build a wildlife crossing, I think on the way out to Oak Island, and then the land on one side of the crossing, they were building a bridge, and they made it better for wildlife. And the land on one side of that bridge ended up getting turned into a development, so it sort of ruined their investment. So we need land trusts to buy into this effort to protect wildlife crossings. And if we can protect them, then that sets the stage up for then advocating for implementing the actual structures. And then, at the federal level, folks in the U.S., if you can ask your congressional representatives, your U.S. reps and your senators to support the National Wildlife Corridors Act, or even co-sponsor it with Representative Beyer, and I think Representative Graves is a Republican that we're working on right now as well. Ask them to support this National Wildlife Corridors Act. There's a lot of websites you can go to find your members of Congress if you don't know who they are and how to get their contact information, but there's one of them. And if you're going to take the time, I suggest calling right now. Emails we think are slightly less effective. So if you have the time to call your congressional representative, ask them to support this National Wildlife Corridors Act. Then also, now would be a great time to ask them to support the red wolf, stand up for red wolf conservation. There's only 35 red wolves left in the wild, and we can send you out the link. There's also a public comment period going on where you can communicate directly with the Fish and Wildlife Service. But the Fish and Wildlife Service, in many ways, right now is responding to Congress, and so we need Congress to support the red wolf as well. And then, even bigger picture, it's you probably noticed that there's an attack being made right now on the entire Endangered Species Act. So again, if you get your congressional representative or their staff on the phone, ask them to also stand up for the Endangered Species Act. We know the public supports it, but they need to hear from you over the next few weeks about that. The Red Wolf comment period, I think, ends July 30th, so it's a little bit more urgent on that front. And then lastly, if you aren't already donating to Wildlands Network, or even if you are, please support supporting us. This kind of road ecology work that we're doing is not cheap. Buying those cameras, they're fairly expensive. Checking the cameras, doing all the field work, doing those roadkill surveys and that kind of thing, it's expensive. We'd like to hire that engineer to help us identify the sort of the feasibility of where to put these structures along I-40 up in the mountains. Here in Durham, we want to hire a videographer to help us make that video to really to compellingly tell the story of how wildlife are getting under this busy highway. So all these different things we need funds for. So please consider donating to Wildlands Network today. That would be really awesome. So with that, I think that sort of wraps up the presentation. If you have questions, there's my contact information, but I will now take a look at the questions, and feel free to, if you have questions, feel free to keep typing them while we look at these, and I'll go through as many as we have time for. So let's see here. I can find. Okay. I'm having trouble reading one question here that show answer questions. Yeah, let's see. The window is so small. Let me see. What do studies of post-installation of crossings tell us about effectiveness and use? Are there studies that tell us how often and whether animals create alternate routes around them to avoid or otherwise ignore? Yeah, we'll start with that one. The best data for evaluating wildlife crossings comes from Banff National Park, actually. The folks at the Tony Clevenger and others at the Western Transportation Institute studied those crossings for, I think, decades, really. And what they found out there was that for the first few years, they looked like they weren't working at all, or at least not very well. And then things like the grizzly bears and the bears, it took them a few years to find the crossing structures, but once they found them, then they started using them. And then the really cool thing is they started showing the bear cubs how to use them. And so it became an intergenerational thing. And so that the data shows that those structures actually were very successful. I think that sort of thing has been found for most wildlife crossing structures that I'm familiar with around the country. They've generally been shown to be pretty effective. So let's see. Prominent landscape architect. Okay, that's the same. All right. Cool. All right. Any other questions? I wonder how I can. No? Okay. Tracy, do you see any other questions that we should address right now, or?
No, I think that's it, Ron.
Okay.
I think you're good.
Excellent. Okay. Well, the folks have my contact information there if you think of more questions, and I think we'll be emailing some stuff out, right?
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and wrap up for the day. I would like to thank everyone one more time for joining us today. And I'd like to take this opportunity to reiterate what Ron said about, we're very grateful for all of you bringing your passion and your resources to Wildlands Network. We could not do this work without your support and participation and advocacy and friendship. You'll soon receive a follow-up email from us with a link to the webinar's recordings. And we invite you to share this with your friends, family, and colleagues, anyone who might want to learn more about this road ecology work in the Southeast. And for those of you who may want more detailed information or have more questions that you think of later, please do contact Ron at wildlandsnetwork.org. And he can also, he and Emily can help you get more involved if you'd like to do that as well. And if you'd like to make a donation or you'd like to discuss your giving plans for the year, you can contact me, Tracy, at wildlandsnetwork.org. Have a great week. Have a great weekend. Remember, we're sharing the roads with millions of critters, so drive safely. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, folks.
Bye, Ron. Thanks.